This story started in a way that felt so normal at the time that I never would have guessed it would turn into something I'd replay in my head later. It wasn't dramatic, planned, or emotional when it began. It was one of those everyday moments that happen when you're comfortable somewhere, surrounded by familiar faces, doing things you've done 100 times before. And that's exactly why it stayed with me, because it reminded me how easily a single sentence can shift the meaning of a moment without you ever intending it to. My best friend and I have known each other for years, long enough that his house has always felt like an extension of my own. I've spent countless afternoons there, just hanging out, talking about life, laughing about nothing important, and sometimes doing absolutely nothing at all. His family always treated me like I belonged there. Not in a forced way, not in an over-the-top way, but in that quiet, genuine way where you feel welcomed without having to earn it every time you walk through the door. His mom was a big part of that environment. She was always kind, always respectful, always present in a way that felt warm but not intrusive. Over the years, I never thought about her in any unusual way. She was just my best friend's mom, someone I said hello to, joked with occasionally, and respected without question. There was never anything strange or uncomfortable about our interactions. They were exactly what you'd expect between someone and their friend's parent, normal, polite, and familiar. The day this happened didn't stand out at all when it started. There was no special occasion, no celebration, no reason to think anything memorable would come out of it. We were just spending time together like we always did. The atmosphere was relaxed, casual, and easy. At some point, my friend stepped away to handle something, leaving me and his mom in the same space, still talking lightly, still comfortable in the silence that comes from familiarity. She mentioned wanting to take a picture. Not for any serious reason, not for social media or anything like that. It was just one of those spontaneous moments where someone feels good about themselves and wants to capture it. She asked if I could take it for her, and without thinking twice, I agreed. It felt as normal as holding the door open or passing someone their phone when they asked. She handed me her phone and stepped into position, adjusting herself slightly, making sure the lighting was right. As I looked at her through the screen, nothing felt strange. She looked confident, comfortable, and relaxed, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that felt natural. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing who you are rather than trying to impress anyone else. Without pausing to think about how it might sound, I said what came to my mind. I told her, casually and honestly, "You look better than girls my age." The words came out easily, without hesitation, without calculation. In that moment, it felt like a simple compliment, nothing more. But as soon as the sentence left my mouth, I became aware of it in a different way. There was a brief pause. Not an awkward one, not an uncomfortable one, just long enough for me to replay what I had said and hear it again with fresh ears. She looked at me, surprised at first, then smiled. It wasn't a dramatic reaction, but it was enough to make me realize that what you mean and how something sounds aren't always the same thing. She laughed lightly, said thank you, and took her phone back to look at the picture. The moment passed quickly. The conversation moved on. Nothing else happened. On the surface, it was just another casual interaction in a normal day. If someone else had been watching, they probably wouldn't have noticed anything at all. But later, when I was alone, the moment came back to me. Not because I felt embarrassed or guilty, but because I started thinking about how words carry weight whether you intend them to or not. What I meant was simple. I was commenting on confidence, self-assurance, and presence. I wasn't thinking about age in a serious way, or comparison in a deeper sense. But once words are spoken, they don't come with explanations attached. That realization made me think about how easily moments can shift based on interpretation. A sentence that feels harmless to one person can land differently with another, depending on context, experience, and perspective. It doesn't mean anyone is wrong. It just means communication is more complex than we like to admit. I thought about my best friend too. About trust and respect, and how those things aren't just about avoiding obvious mistakes. Sometimes they're about being aware of how even innocent words can be perceived. Nothing inappropriate happened, and nothing needed to be addressed, but the awareness itself felt important. What stayed with me most wasn't her reaction, but my own. That brief internal pause where I realized how quickly honesty can sound different than you expect. It made me more conscious of how I speak, especially in situations where familiarity can make you a little too relaxed. As time went on, the moment faded into the background of everyday life, but the lesson stayed. I became more intentional with my words, more aware of how compliments can land, and more mindful of the responsibility that comes with being comfortable around people who trust you. Not every lesson comes from conflict or confrontation. Some come quietly, from moments that end without drama but leave you thinking long after. Looking back now, I don't see that moment as a mistake. I see it as a reminder. A reminder that words matter, that intention doesn't always control impact, and that awareness is something you build over time through experiences you don't expect to be meaningful when they happen. And that's why I wanted to share this story. Not because anything shocking happened, but because it highlights something subtle and real. The way everyday moments can teach you about maturity, respect, and the power of language without ever turning into a problem. I kept thinking about how easy it is to underestimate small interactions, especially when they happen in places where you feel completely at ease. Familiar environments can lower your guard in ways you don't always notice. When you're comfortable, you speak more freely, joke more casually, and say things without filtering them the same way you might around strangers. That comfort isn't a bad thing, but it does mean that moments like this can sneak up on you, carrying more meaning than you ever planned. Over the next few days, nothing changed on the surface. I still went over to my friend's place, still talked with his mom the same way I always had, still felt that same sense of normalcy. There was no awkwardness, no tension, no unspoken weirdness hanging in the air. If anything, that made the situation feel even more reflective for me, because it showed that not every moment needs to turn into a problem to still teach you something. Sometimes, the lesson is entirely internal. I found myself thinking more deeply about compliments in general. How often we use them without really considering their layers. A compliment can be encouraging, validating, and kind, but it can also unintentionally create comparisons or meanings that weren't part of the original thought. In this case, my words compared generations, even if that wasn't my intention. I started realizing how easily language can shift from observation to implication without us realizing it. What made me reflect even more was recognizing the difference between intent and impact. Intent lives in your head. Impact lives in someone else's experience. You can have the best intentions in the world, but once words leave your mouth, they're no longer fully yours. They're shaped by how the other person hears them, what they've lived through, and what the moment means to them. That doesn't mean you should be afraid to speak. It just means awareness matters. I also thought about age and perspective. When you're younger, you don't always realize how statements involving age can carry more weight than you expect. What feels like a harmless comparison can touch on confidence, self-image, or validation in ways you didn't consider. That realization didn't make me regret what I said, but it did make me more thoughtful about how I phrase things going forward. At one point, I wondered if she even thought about the moment afterward the way I did. Maybe to her, it was just a nice compliment that boosted her mood for a few seconds before life moved on. That possibility actually helped me put things into perspective. Sometimes we assign weight to moments because of what they reveal about us, not because of how deeply they affected someone else. As time passed, the memory settled into something calmer. It stopped replaying in my head constantly and instead became a reference point. A quiet reminder I could return to whenever I found myself about to speak without thinking. It helped me slow down just enough to consider how my words might land, especially in situations where respect and familiarity overlap. I also realized how much maturity is tied to self-awareness rather than perfection. You don't need to avoid every possible misinterpretation to be respectful. You just need to be willing to reflect when moments give you the opportunity to do so. Growth doesn't always come from being corrected by someone else. Sometimes it comes from recognizing something on your own and deciding to do better next time. Nothing dramatic ever followed that moment. There was no confrontation, no uncomfortable conversation, no fallout of any kind. Life continued in its usual rhythm, and that's what made the lesson feel genuine rather than forced. It wasn't tied to fear or embarrassment. It was tied to understanding. Looking back now, I see that moment as a quiet turning point in how I approach communication. It taught me that words don't need to be harsh to be powerful, and they don't need to cause conflict to be meaningful. Even simple, honest sentences can reveal areas where you can become more thoughtful, more aware, and more intentional. That's why this story isn't about something going wrong. It's about something being noticed. About recognizing that everyday interactions carry layers we don't always see at first. And about understanding that respect isn't just about avoiding obvious boundaries, but about being mindful of the subtle ones too. As I kept living my normal routine, I started noticing how often moments like this happen in everyday life, not just to me, but to everyone. Small comments, quick reactions, honest thoughts spoken out loud without much filtering. Most of the time, they pass without consequence, but every now and then, one of them sticks with you. Not because it caused trouble, but because it revealed something about how you communicate and how you see the people around you. I began paying closer attention to how people give and receive compliments. Some compliments are easy, almost automatic. Others carry layers that aren't obvious until you stop and think about them. I realized that when you're comfortable with someone, especially someone older or someone you've known for a long time, it's easy to forget that familiarity doesn't erase context. Roles, relationships, and expectations still exist, even when everything feels relaxed and friendly. That awareness slowly changed how I spoke, not in a forced or stiff way, but in a more intentional one. I didn't stop being honest, and I didn't stop being kind. I just learned to pause for a second longer before saying certain things. That pause became a habit, and over time, it felt less like restraint and more like maturity. It wasn't about holding back who I was, it was about choosing words that matched my respect for the people I was talking to. There were moments when I caught myself about to say something similar to someone else, and I adjusted it slightly. Not because the original thought was wrong, but because I understood that clarity matters. Saying what you mean in a way that can't be misunderstood is a skill, and it's one you don't really learn until you've had moments that make you reflect like this. I also thought about how confidence is perceived differently depending on who's expressing it and who's observing it. When someone carries themselves with ease, it stands out. Complimenting that confidence isn't wrong, but framing it matters. I realized that appreciation doesn't need comparison to be meaningful. You can acknowledge someone's presence or energy without placing it against something else. From time to time, I'd think about that day again, but with less intensity and more clarity. It stopped feeling like a moment I needed to analyze and started feeling like a lesson I'd already absorbed. There was no lingering discomfort, no unresolved feeling, just understanding, and that's when I knew it had done its job. What I appreciate most about the experience now is how subtle it was. Nothing exploded, no one was hurt, no relationships were strained, and yet, it still shaped the way I move through conversations today. That's a reminder that growth doesn't always come from big mistakes. Sometimes it comes from noticing something small and choosing to learn from it quietly. I never felt the need to bring it up again, and neither did she. That, in itself, felt like confirmation that the moment didn't need fixing. It had simply passed, leaving behind a small shift in awareness. Life continued exactly as it should have, with the same comfort, the same respect, and the same sense of normalcy. Looking back now, I understand that moments like this are part of growing up. They sit in that space between intention and interpretation, where you start to realize that communication is as much about listening and awareness as it is about speaking. You don't need to be perfect to be respectful. You just need to be willing to learn. That's why I don't tell this story as a warning or a confession. I tell it as an example of how ordinary life teaches you lessons when you're paying attention. How a single sentence, spoken without much thought, can still guide you toward being a little more thoughtful the next time. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Not that you should be afraid of your words, but that you should value them. Because even the simplest ones can shape a moment, a memory, or a mindset. And when you choose to carry that awareness forward, you grow, not loudly, not dramatically, but genuinely.